Before the split, before the controversy, before the survivor testimonies, before the organisation became known around the world as the Revival Centres International, there was revival. To understand the Revival Centres, we first need to go back to post-war Australia, a time when Pentecostal Christianity was rapidly growing across the country. Across Australia in the 1950s, revival campaigns were drawing huge crowds. Tent meetings, healing services, evangelistic crusades, and emotional altar calls were becoming increasingly common. Pentecostal movements focused heavily on spirit baptism, divine healing, evangelism, and especially speaking in tongues as evidence of receiving the Holy Spirit. One of the most influential of these groups was the National Revival Crusade, later known as the Commonwealth Revival Crusade, and eventually the Christian Revival Crusade, or CRC. It was inside this movement that a young preacher named Lloyd Longfield first emerged. At the time, the Pentecostal movement in Australia was still relatively small compared to mainstream Christianity, but it was growing rapidly. The movement attracted people searching for certainty, spiritual experience, healing, and direct encounters with God. Many believers genuinely felt they were witnessing the restoration of the early church described in the book of Acts. And within this atmosphere of revival and expectation, new leaders quickly began to emerge. One of those leaders was Lloyd Longfield. People who knew Lloyd Longfield during those early years consistently describe him as energetic, charismatic, passionate, and deeply evangelistic. He was not seen as a fringe figure or outsider at this stage. In fact, many people remembered him very positively. One former associate described Lloyd as someone with enormous evangelical zeal, constantly witnessing, constantly preaching, constantly trying to bring people into the movement. Another recalled seeing Lloyd speaking to strangers on the beach at Port Lonsdale, passionately talking to people about God and trying to convert them. This was the atmosphere of Australian Pentecostalism during the 1950s. Revival was everything. Preaching was urgent. Salvation was urgent. And for many people involved in these movements, there was a genuine belief that God was restoring true New Testament Christianity in the last days before the return of Christ. Speaking in tongues became central to this belief system. To many Pentecostals of the era, receiving the Holy Spirit, evidenced by speaking in tongues, was seen as proof that someone had truly experienced God. This teaching would later become one of the defining foundations of the Revival Centres movement itself. At the time, Lloyd Longfield was still operating within the broader revival culture of the CRC environment. He was not yet building a separate movement. He was a rising preacher inside it. But even during these early years, some people began noticing signs of strong leadership ambition and increasing independence. Former insiders would later claim that Lloyd was determined to build something bigger than a local assembly. One former associate later reflected that even without the doctrinal controversies that emerged later, some kind of separation probably would have happened eventually anyway. According to that account, Lloyd Longfield was already becoming a forceful and influential personality within the movement. And over time, tensions between revival enthusiasm, leadership authority, and doctrinal control would slowly begin growing beneath the surface. One of the major issues emerging during this period involved demon deliverance ministry, the practice of casting demons out of people. Deliverance became one of the most controversial and divisive topics within Pentecostal circles during the era. Former members described serious disagreements beginning to emerge over how far these practices should go, and whether some leaders had become too extreme. As tensions increased, factions slowly began forming inside the broader revival movement. Some leaders believed the movement was losing spiritual power. Others believed things were becoming dangerous and excessive. But according to some people who knew Lloyd personally, The deeper issue may not simply have been theology. One former insider later stated, Lloyd had ambitions. Even if there had been no deliverance problem, the same thing would have happened. Eventually, the tensions reached breaking point. According to later accounts from within the movement, Lloyd Longfield rejected new teachings being introduced by leadership above him and refused to support them. Rather than submit to oversight, he separated from CRC and began forming a movement of his own. Ironically, decades later, critics inside the revival centres would use this exact same argument against Lloyd himself. One pastor famously stated, if Lloyd had obeyed his oversight, there would never have been any revival centres. But in the late 1950s, Lloyd Longfield was no critic in waiting. He was building something new. For many people inside the revival movement at the time, this separation was not viewed as rebellion. It was viewed as conviction. Supporters believed the established churches had become spiritually compromised and that strong leadership was necessary to restore what they saw as true New Testament Christianity. The idea of restoration would become one of the central foundations of the emerging revival centers movement. Followers increasingly believed that they were part of something unique, not simply another Pentecostal church, but a movement specially raised up by God in the last days. And as more people joined the movement, Lloyd Longfield's influence and authority continued to grow. As the movement developed, names changed and structures evolved. The Commonwealth Revival Crusade emerged from the earlier revival environment before eventually developing into what became known as the Revival Centers movement. The movement increasingly separated itself from mainstream churches and presented itself as part of a restored New Testament Christianity. For followers, this was not simply another denomination, it was truth restored. The message focused heavily on restoration Christianity, the belief that mainstream churches had become compromised and that true biblical Christianity needed to be restored exactly as it existed in the book of Acts. The core teachings included spirit baptism, speaking in tongues, holiness, evangelism, strict biblical authority, and separation from what were viewed as spiritually corrupt churches. The movement grew rapidly. Assemblies began appearing across Australia. Leadership structures formed. Camps, conventions, evangelism programs, and systems of oversight developed around the movement. Over time, the revival centers developed a strong internal identity and culture. For many members, the movement became more than religion. It became family, community, purpose, truth itself. And as the movement expanded, so did the authority of its leadership. What began as a revival movement was slowly becoming an organized international structure. But movements built around certainty often struggle with disagreement. And over time, the same tensions that helped create the revival centers would eventually begin growing inside them. Authority, doctrine, oversight, submission, control. The very issues that once caused separation from the CRC would slowly begin resurfacing inside the movement itself. And decades later, those tensions would explode into one of the biggest divisions in revival centers history. That story comes later. In the next episode, we examine the leadership structure that helped build the revival centers movement, the men behind the expansion, the assemblies, and the growing culture of authority that would shape the organisation for decades to come. I'm Hawley. This is Taboo Talk.